word, and I might know this person. It's my wife, Jane Coles, who's going to bring us our reading from the Gospel for this Sunday. Thank you, Jane.
Reading from John 2, verses 13 to 22. Jesus clears the temple. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration, so Jesus went to Jerusalem. In the temple area, he saw merchants selling cattle, sheep, and doves for sacrifices. He also saw dealers at tables exchanging foreign money. Jesus made a whip from some ropes and chased them all out of the temple. He drove out the sheep and cattle, scattered the money changers' coins over the floor, and turned over their tables. Then, going over to the people who sold doves, he told them, "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." Then his disciples remembered this prophecy from the scriptures. "Passion for my God's house will consume me." But the Jewish leaders demanded, "What are you doing? If God gave you authority to do this, show us a miraculous sign to prove it." "All right," Jesus replied, "destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." "What?" they exclaimed. "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you can rebuild it in 3 days." But when Jesus said "this temple," he meant his own body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered he had said this, and they believed both the scriptures and what Jesus had said. Thanks be to God for his word. Amen.
Well, thank you, Jane, for bringing us that word. Friends, in our passage from John chapter 2, we find Jesus in Jerusalem. And 2,000 years ago, many saw Jerusalem as the very center of the known world. Maps were actually produced in that way. And so such was its importance and significance, but not least to the Jewish people themselves. And as it were, Jesus, an unknown traveling preacher from a small town in the north called Nazareth, well, he hits the big city. Well, literally, you could say. But as Jesus enters this capital city, he enters it not in the low season, a time of quiet streets with few visitors. No, he enters it at the very height of the high season, for it's almost Passover time. And any Jew from anywhere in the world who had the means and the freedom to travel, well, they'd want to be in there. They'd want to be in Jerusalem. And so it's crowded, almost bursting at the seams, with people from, dare I say, the four corners of the world. Friends, I'm told that the same is true today. You see, if we're able to visit Jerusalem at the time of Passover, well, you'd find it absolutely packed with people shoulder to shoulder in the narrow market streets and around the holy sites. There would be a sensory overload with the sights and smells and sounds, not least with a cacophony of noise from the Western Wall as 100,000 or so Jews gather, both for the priestly blessing and to add their prayers to the prayers of the centuries, lamenting at the loss of the temple. Yes, the temple. For here in our passage from John, Jesus enters the temple courts, and he sees a spectacle which stirred him to violent anger. And for me, Jesus demonstrates both his true humanity and his true divinity in this action. But why? Why does Jesus experience and express the anger he feels? Well, 2,000 years ago, the temple is where God dwells. It is a place for people to go so that they may pray, they may worship, and they may encounter God. So when Jesus enters the temple and sees all the merchants and the money changers, it's understandable as to why this would frustrate and upset him so much. Such was our Lord's zeal, our Lord's passion for the house of God. So let's just today just unpack a little bit more of what's going on in this passage. Now, of course, the markets would have been in the outer courts of the temple, which is the only area in which the Gentiles, that's you and me, we would have been able to go to pray, to worship, and yes, to meet with God. However, the Gentiles were not the only ones to be inconvenienced, dare I say, in the placement of this market, as the noise and the smell would have spread into all the other areas of the temple. I was watching a food program the other day, and I learned that artichokes are very bitter. I don't remember eating an artichoke, but if you cut up an artichoke and get it on your hands, everything you taste tastes of artichoke and its bitterness. Well, the smells of that marketplace would have spread throughout the temple. Again, the other problem by this placement of the market was that the selling of cattle and the changing of coins was taking place in the temple. Something that had previously taken place outside of the temple in the Kidron Valley. Yet for some reason, it was now here, within the temple and within the temple courts. Okay, so the fact that markets existed was not the issue, as they were necessary. For under the Jewish law, all animals that were sacrificed to God had to be unblemished. And the long journeys that people would have had to take to the temple would have risked damaging their own animals, therefore making them unacceptable as a sacrifice. And again, the money changers, well, they were also required, as people would have been traveling from other nations, and only certain coins were acceptable to use in the temple, so that people would have had to exchange currency in order to purchase animals for sacrifice or to pay the temple tax, the upkeep of the temple, or yes, to make their offerings to the temple. And so it must be said that whilst there is nothing inherently wrong with what they are doing, the fact that they are doing it in the temple is what is distressing to Jesus. Which is why in verse 16, he criticizes them by saying in the New International Version, "Stop turning my Father's house into a market." Now, in one of the other synoptics, in Luke's account of this event, he uses the more striking phrase, "den of thieves," instead of market. And so there is also a suggestion that perhaps some of the traders, and in particular the money changers, were acting unfairly. And were doing so as to increase their own wealth, rather than offer a service to those who visit a temple. And all of this is what led to Jesus expressing his anger. And my friends, when Jesus gets angry, he doesn't hold on to it or smile and pretend that everything's okay. Neither does he remain placid in the face of his anger he's feeling. Instead, he allows himself to really feel his emotions, and he expresses them here through his action. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I am not advocating chasing people with whips or turning over tables in church, although I do occasionally wonder if some people I know quite well at times feel that way. No, Jesus' response to the way he felt was specific to the situation he was in. But what we learn from Jesus, what we learn importantly from Jesus, is that, well, being angry is not sinful. Indeed, it's a natural reaction to events and circumstances that cause us and others pain. And that Jesus also shows us that it's important for us to allow ourselves to experience and to express our emotions. My friends, in this passage, Jesus' words and actions in clearing the temple show us who he is and that he is the one you and I, can turn to for help and comfort as we encounter situations that cause us pain and anger. He is the one we can turn to. For when Jesus is chasing the market traders out of the temple, in verse 16, he uses the phrase, "my Father's house." And that is important, for Jesus is identifying himself as the Son of God. For his use of the phrase in verse 16 and his act of clearing the temple, along with the disciples' act of remembering in verse 17, also links us to Zechariah's prophecy of the day of the Lord in Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 20 and 21. And that day of the Lord is brought about by the coming of the Messiah, Jesus, the one who saves. For in verses 18 and 19, we have the challenge as to what authority Jesus has to do these things, to do the things that he has done. And when he's challenged as to that authority, well, Jesus says, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days." Of course, like the disciples, we with hindsight, well, we know that Jesus is referring to his death and resurrection. However, what is of interest is the word that Jesus uses for temple. For it's the word noan, N-O-A-N. And this word refers to the sanctuary where God's Spirit dwells and where people come to meet with God. Let me say that again. This word refers to where God's Spirit dwells and where people come to meet with God. I just want to conclude by saying that, friends, as important as our buildings are to us, do you know, places where people have worshipped and met with God for decades, centuries, or even millennia, God meets with us wherever we are in the person of Jesus Christ. And it is he who, through his resurrection and death on the cross, has brought us our salvation. And it is to him that we can bring our hurt. It is to him that we can bring our pain and our anguish and our emotions to a God who knows and who, I believe, truly understands. And so finally, wherever you are today, whatever you are going through, God is there for you. His love and grace is there for you. For it's the same love and grace that meets us in the love and sacrifice, power and victory of the cross of Christ. And it's a love and a grace that meets you and me in our anger and our frustration and, yes, our pain. You see, I believe in a God who holds us in love and gives us a safe space to experience and express all our emotions. And he can comfort and guide us. So, friends, today, may we know God's grace. May we know God's peace as we welcome him into our lives, as we make our home in him and he in us, as we choose to live to Christ's praise and glory. Amen.